Hi, Misha here, and in the past I've covered a good number of Japan's cruisers and battleships and aircraft carriers from World War II, especially those in the Eaglemoss collection of 1,100 scale die-cast models, and now it's time to cover a couple of American aircraft carriers from World War II. And there's only these two in the Eaglemoss collection from America. We have the USS Enterprise of the Yorktown class, probably the most famous single carrier that America operated in World War II. And we have the USS Intrepid of the Essex class, probably the single most famous class and most important class of World War II. And in this video, we're going to talk about the Essex class ships, as well as the USS Intrepid CV-11 herself. And whereas the Yorktown class, as well as the previous Lexington class, these were built to treaty restrictions and therefore had to have certain compromises made. When it came time to the Essex class, these were no longer really of concern, because by the time these were becoming really part of the American Navy, the treaties were long since gone. To that end, they weren't necessarily that much bigger than the Yorktowns, and they were actually, by tonnage, even smaller than the previous Lexingtons, but they were the most advanced carriers that America had, and really the most advanced and most heavily produced carriers in the world. They would order a total of 32 of these. Of those, 26 would be started, 24 would be completed, and none would be lost in World War II, so quite a remarkable record, although a couple came close. They were exceedingly well designed and were very influential. They had a designed tonnage of 27,000 tons standard, but in actuality that was closer to 30,000 tons, which went up to 36,000 tons fully loaded. And then after World War II, during refits, this would climb over 40,000. The initial aircraft carriers were a little over 870 feet long, and then later versions, known as the longbow, were actually just under 890 feet long. Interestingly, the short bow versions were with longer flight decks of about 860 feet. The longbow versions were actually cut back a bit to give better firing arcs up front, down to about 845 feet. These were designed to carry up to 100 aircraft, plus spares, and to be able to get up to nearly 33 knots, considering making them very fast for that day and time. And of course they had anti-aircraft defense that was improved throughout World War II. And they had crew that would fluctuate, but were always well over 2,000, and sometimes nearly double that depending on the mission. And they would serve from 1943 to when the final one was decommissioned in 1991. A very remarkable service record, to say the least. So with that, let's get into the development of the most produced capital ship of the 20th century, the Essex class. The story behind the Essex class dates back to the end of 1936, when Japan, Italy, Germany, and others pretty much just repudiated any treaty obligations. Things that had dated back to 1922 in the Washington Naval Treaty, then the First London and Second London treaties. So in 1937, there were no tonnage limits, there were no caps on the size, caliber of guns. America was free to design whatever it could. And so work began. And the idea behind the new class of carrier, they had a few different goals. For one, they wanted it to be able to carry 4 squadrons plus a 5th in reserve. In addition to that, it needed to be able to carry at least 25% of all spare parts for its aircraft to allow for longer cruises, so it could keep its planes going longer. It also needed to be able to launch and recover aircraft faster than on previous classes. It needed to be more survivable. And it needed to be able to serve for a long time, have a good lifespan, be a good investment for the money, and subsequently be able to be updated, have problems that were found fixed, and have new technologies integrated as they came along. And to be honest, in every account, every way, the Essex class succeeded. In May of 1938, Congress, who had been very tight with spending for any military, including the Navy, finally allocated funding for about 40,000 tons in new carriers. That's where the sister ship of Enterprise would come from, USS Hornet, the last of the Yorktown classes. And the Hornet would be the first built without treaty restrictions. And where work would really officially begin on the USS Essex, CV-09. And the first 3 in the class, including Intrepid here, would be ordered on July 3rd, 1940. I guess that was the nation's birthday gift to itself. And then more would be ordered in September. And then the final 2 would be ordered a week after Pearl Harbor in 1941, just as the first were getting somewhat close to completion. They were still a ways out. But at the same time, after Pearl Harbor, that's really when Congress threw down the gauntlet and pretty much told Japan, okay, you want to play? Fine. Congress allocated funding in 1941, December, to build 19 more Essex class, not counting the 10 plus already under construction. And the first 10 of these new ships would be ordered in August of 1942, and then there would be subsequent orders in 1943 and in 1944. 32 would ultimately be ordered. However, the last batch would never be laid down. Still yet, 24 of these aircraft carriers were completed. And of those, at least 14 saw active combat. So they were used. But it would not be until 1943 that the first, USS Essex, was ready, with Intrepid here coming a short time later, along with their other sister ships. So in 1942, the existing carrier fleet, Enterprise, along with Lexington and Saratoga and Yorktown and Hornet and Wasp, would have to toe the line, and much to the chagrin, many of those were lost. I find it highly amusing that America's response to this was to simply rename some of the Essex class under construction. So just as Japan thought they had sunk the Yorktown and the Lexington, the U.S. just built new ones and better ones and more dangerous ones. So yeah, it was just a very interesting turn of fate. Not to mention, honoring those crews, and of course the historical battles that they were named after. So what exactly did American industry come up with here? What made the Essex so effective? Obviously, it had a very good top speed. It had good armor protection. It had good anti-aircraft defense, which only improved. From the outset, it had multiple types of radar, very modern at the time. It had equipment to recognize friend or foe aircraft. Many new modern navigation gear. New radio equipment. Pretty much all the newest, fanciest electronics they could. Like I said, it could carry 90 or more aircraft. And these weren't the older aircraft. We're talking the cutting edge, like the F-6F Hellcat, eventually the F-4U, the SB-2C Helldiver, and of course the good old TBM Avenger. To help recover aircraft faster and move them around, it took the elevator on the edge of the flight deck that had been pioneered with the USS Wasp and integrated it. This had a lot of advantages. It was a more reliable elevator system. It also meant that if it was knocked out, it wouldn't leave a giant hole in the middle of the flight deck, which is a problem Japanese carriers like Teiho had to endure. It also meant that they could continue more operations while the elevator was operating itself. And while many previous American carriers had catapults, this was one of the first to really start to use them, at least heavily, towards the end of the war, again with the heavier aircraft of the day. And to make production quicker, easier, more efficient, they used as many straight, simple components as possible, tried to make manufacturing just that much easier. They also used as many lighter weight alloys as possible. At the same time, they gave her quite good armor. And probably even more important, they had very good damage control, very well trained teams, and just very modern systems. And they continued to improve them throughout production. For example, better ventilation. And like I said, originally they had the short bow, but later they would go to the long bow designs, which had a few improvements, mostly to do with the defensive anti-aircraft fire. They also had more fuel storage than previous carriers, and they had safer storage for their bombs and munitions. It really was just a culmination of what the U.S. Navy had learned after operating aircraft carriers for 15 plus years. And to that end, quite effective. And they had the benefit of seeing what did and didn't work throughout 1942. And of course, by the time the USS Essex was commissioned in January of 1943, the Japanese Navy had already taken a couple of major hits, especially to their aircraft carrier fleet. And It, along with sister ships, started to see service in mid-1943. One of the early uses was during attack on Rabaul in November of that year, an event I refer to quite a bit in Japanese videos because it was important, and basically they just decimated Japanese air power throughout the Pacific in 1943 and 1944, both Navy and Army Air Forces. Moving into 1944, they were very important during the Marianas, the Great Turkey Shoot. They also there were to help MacArthur retake the Philippines. And they just dominated. Early on, the U.S. Navy operated carriers, at least the carrier group, singly, or maybe in pairs of two, thinking that splitting them apart would make them harder to detect and destroy by the enemy. But after that year, they really realized that it was better to group them. Because, yes, while it made bigger targets for the enemy, it also meant their cap, their air cover, their air protection could cover each other, and if one got in trouble, another one could protect it. And they could just really amass their dive bombers and torpedo bombers to just deliver a sledgehammer blow to the enemy. So these started operating in fast carrier groups, sometimes as many as 6 S6s. It's very late. Would operate together. And if you consider they had 90 plus planes per carrier, that should just tell you the kind of power that they could get into the air. And of course, each carrier had its own escort on top of all of that, plus they had submarine screens and so on and so forth. A very remarkable boat. But of course, they would take some bruises, and some sailors would lose their lives on board these ships. Famously, the two Essex-class carriers that came the closest to being lost were the USS Franklin and the USS Bunker Hill. In March of 1945, during operations leading up to the invasion of Okinawa, the USS Franklin was hit with 2 large bombs, which penetrated her armor, started many fires, and got to the point of her own ordnance detonating inside. It was hell. Over 700 sailors died, and nearly 300 were injured. So, of her crew of around 2,800, basically a third or more were incapacitated or just lost. It was so bad that her captain was basically given permission to and even asked to abandon ship and just scuttle her. But he refused, and thanks to extremely valiant efforts of the damage control teams, some of whom would also lose their lives, Franklin was saved just barely. And so that's a testament to those who created the Franklin and also those who crewed her. After the Okinawa invasion in May, the USS Bunker Hill would suffer a similar fate. She would be hit by 2 kamikaze fighters, both armed with heavy bombs. And she too would have a good bit of flooding and fires, with nearly 400 killed and over 260 injured. Both would make it back to the United States, and basically both would be so severely damaged, and with the war ending, neither one was really ever returned to full service. Both were just kind of allowed to be retired and scrapped. So what about the USS Intrepid here? The Big Eye, or the Dry Eye. Well, she was laid down on December 1st, 1941, so just a few days before Pearl Harbor. And she was launched in April of 1943 and commissioned in August of that year. And she would undergo training, finally setting sail for combat in December and getting towards Pearl Harbor and going into combat. At the end of January, she would go on her first combat mission along with her sister ship, USS Essex, where they would generally be assigned to destroy Japanese aircraft wherever they could, and specifically striking targets on the island of Kwajalein. But that was just kind of a preamble. Her biggest contribution early on was in the middle of February, when planes from Intrepid raided the Japanese naval port, the harbor at Truk, which had previously been considered a safe harbor. They would damage several vessels, sink a few destroyers, and sink quite a bit of merchant and supply and troop tonnage, and did a major morale ding against the Japanese. So much so that they never would really trust the base at Truk again, and eventually kind of lead to them more or less getting out of there. But, speaking of getting out of there, Intrepid herself, newly commissioned, would be hit by a torpedo from a Japanese plane. It did moderate damage. It did lead to some flooding, and it would jam up the rudder, and they would make way to Pearl Harbor at the end of the month for temporary repairs, but then have to head back to San Francisco for more permanent repairs. So she was out of the fight until June, at which time she was ready to go again, and for the rest of the summer she would do some training, kind of work up, get some new crew going, new aircraft. By September she was back in combat, and by October of 1944 she was a critical factor in the retaking of the Philippines, the whole Philippines campaign. And she would begin her part during the battle for Leyte on October 20th. And then on the 24th, that morning, it was actually a reconnaissance plane from Intrepid that would spot the Japanese ship Yamato, which I've done more than a few videos on, and sister ship to Musashi, the Japanese flagship at the time. And this would lead to several days of intense fighting. And at the end of the day, Intrepid took part in helping to sink Musashi, as well as damage Yamato and sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. But yet again, she did not get out unscathed. Towards the end, on October 27, a kamikaze plane would hit Intrepid, doing moderate, pretty light damage, honestly. But then as the campaign would continue into November, on the 25th, 2 more kamikaze would hit her, doing more damage to an already somewhat damaged ship, and again, Intrepid would have to go back to San Francisco for repairs. So she was out of the fight for December and January, and would return to full service that February. Again, the damage wasn't too major, but she's already earning a reputation for getting beat up a bit. But on the other hand, you have to give her credit that she took the blows, and she definitely dealt back to the Japanese as well. So moving into March 1945, Intrepid would prepare for the invasion of Okinawa, along with most of the rest of the fleet. And again, she would be damaged by a near miss from a G-4M Betty bomber. While the bomber would not hit her, some debris and flaming fuel from it would splash onto her flight deck, starting some fires. But again, quick damage control response, put them out, not a big deal, minor at best. In a bit of retaliation, she would take part on the attack of what remained of the Japanese Navy at Kure. Another event I reference quite a bit in the Japanese videos, because that was really what was left was pretty much there. And so, of course, after April 1st, the invasion of Okinawa, she was there to strike land targets with her planes and, of course, take out any potential Japanese air power, which didn't really exist much. At least you would think so, up until April 16th, when she was yet again hit by another kamikaze. This is when they're starting to use them in very large numbers. The damage was moderate, fires were started, but she was only out of action for about 3 hours, after which her flight deck was open for business again, and she would continue her duties. It wasn't until May that she would sail back home, stopping off at Pearl Harbor briefly, and then to San Francisco for repairs. Those were done at the end of June, and she would waste no time in heading back into the fight, getting off the coast of Japan on August 6th and beginning to strike targets again inland, because at this point the Japanese Navy was basically 3 rubber rafts and a wooden dinghy. Seriously, even the ships they had left in August, they didn't have fuel for. So anyway, and the airplanes they had left, which they still had some, were usually outdated and just straight up kamikaze. Nevertheless, she served her duties until August 15th, when she was told to halt offensive operations pending the official surrender of Japan. And then a week later, she would transfer to Japan to help support the occupation movement, and she would be on station until the end of the year, at which time she would head back home, and she would be transferred to San Francisco Bay in early 1946. She would be reduced to reserve that summer, and then she would be officially decommissioned on March 22nd, 1947, and placed in the Reserve Pacific Fleet. And that could have very well been the end of Intrepid's career, after only a few years of honest but hard service. However, as I said at the beginning, the whole point behind the whole Essex class was to have a long lifespan and to be upgradable. So virtually all the surviving carriers, aside from Franklin and Bunker Hill, would have post-war careers of one type or another. After World War II, like Intrepid, all of the other short hulls were laid up, and a majority of the long hulls, but it wouldn't last. The Korean War. In February of 1952, Intrepid was reactivated and then sent to Norfolk to be updated to operate jet aircraft. She was reclassified at the end of the year as CVA-11, so she became an attack carrier. Her conversion with new equipment was done in 1954. Foremost among these, they replaced the old hydraulic catapults with new steam catapults, and actually in October she was the first to use these. And she would operate such aircraft. She would then join the Atlantic Fleet in 1955, patrolling the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic coast. And then she would go in for another refit. This time she would get the new fancy angled flight deck, of which many of the Essex class that were still around would get. These are still kicking. This upgrade would be completed in 1957. Then she would go on an extended training shakedown cruise and have a few more patrols at the end of the decade. And then in 1961 she would be reclassified yet again as CVS-11, this time as an anti-submarine patrol carrier. And after a minor refit again, she would actually be used in 1962 to recover one of the Mercury capsules, Aurora 7. And then again in 1965, she would recover Gemini, or Gemini as some in NASA always called them, 3. And she would also be doing submarine patrols in the interim. And then, between 1966 and 1969, she would have 3 tours, 3 deployments to Vietnam, where she operated some planes like the A-1, but also some more modern jets like the A-4 and the F-8. I've done videos on all 3 of those, so that's a thing if you're interested. And then in 1970, her combat was pretty much over. Between 70 and 72, she would be doing anti-submarine patrols, primarily in either the Mediterranean or the North Atlantic, even sometimes going above the Arctic Circle. She would also participate in several NATO exercises and fleet maneuvers. And then her final patrol would be again in the Mediterranean, and then she would be finally decommissioned for real this time in March of 1974. And Intrepid would be turned into an Air and Space Museum, which it still is today, off of New York City. In fact, one of the NASA shuttles is part of that museum now. And obviously by the 1970s, despite continuous updates and modernizations, the Essexes were being retired out because new supercarriers were just becoming too advanced even for these to keep up. But not bad considering she was in service for over 30 years. Not bad at all. That said, the last Essex would not be retired out of active service until 1991 because one of the class was kept as the U.S. Navy's training carrier between 1956 and 1991 at all times. The exact ship would be changed out, but one of them. And of course these would serve in Korea and Vietnam. I believe 11 served in Korea and 13 were used in some capacity in Vietnam. Obviously they couldn't operate some of the newer, larger, heavier jets like the F-4 Phantom, at least not comfortably. So that was left to carriers like the Forrestal class. And of course the Enterprise's replacement, CV-65. Where did I put it? There it is. Hello. And eventually time caught up with the Essex. But they had a very long career, all things considered. So pretty good bang for their buck for America, to be honest. It's amazing how many they built. Very important to the Pacific War effort. And very important in the Pacific and Atlantic throughout the Cold War period, too. A lot of aircraft launched off these carriers. This video might seem a little rushed. If so, that's probably very true. I had this model on order for a very long time, and it took 2 months to get here. So when it finally came in today, I just really wanted to do a video on it, even if it's late. It was a bit of a epic to get it. In fact, it's kind of weird that it came today, because it was showing as getting to my post office about 6 this morning, but then not out for delivery, and then they delivered our mail at around 10 a.m., but then around 6 p.m. they delivered mail again, at least a couple of books my wife had ordered, and this. So the mail actually came twice today, and this came late in the day when I was pretty much resigned to it not coming till at least tomorrow. As long as I've waited for it. I had to order it out of China, which always takes time. But on top of that, it got sent to the wrong post office. They said it was sorted incorrectly, so it took a jaunt up to Missouri. But it made it, and I guess that's all that really matters in the end, right? So I just wanted to do a video on the Intrepid and the Essex class in general. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, or just want to talk about U.S. history, feel free to do so. With that, I'm going to call it a night. This is Misha, and I will catch you very soon next time.